The Glarf draft happened last weekend, and I've got last year's champion Lucas Beery on the line to break down how he intends to become a two-time champ and take a look at all the other interesting picks right here on the RotoWire Fantasy Baseball Podcast. Hello and welcome, everybody, to the Thursday edition of the RotoWire Fantasy Baseball Podcast, brought to you by Fantrax. I'm Erik Halterman, and I am joined today by Lucas Beery of FTN Fantasy. More importantly, defending Glarf champion Lucas Beery. Lucas, did you wear your championship belt the whole way home, or did you have to stick it in the trunk?
Put it in the trunk and looked at it a little bit when I got home, but that was about it. So pretty nice little deal, though. So I thank Dave for that.
It's not up on the wall behind you. Where is it?
I'm still figuring that out. So I've got a little bit of time before opening day, but we'll get there.
All right, fair enough. We will be getting into the Glarf draft pretty soon, but as usual, I want to start with some headlines. And one of the headlines concerns a player who you, Lucas, took in Glarf last weekend, Zach Neto. Confirmed that Neto is going to miss opening day, but that he shouldn't miss too much more time as he works his way back from shoulder surgery. I think this is good news. I mean, this is a slight change from where his status was when you drafted him over the weekend, and this is probably something that's going to cause people to move him up the draft board, do you think, or is this negative news? I mean, do you look at the fact that it's confirmed he's going to miss some time, but probably not a lot of time, is that better than expected, or is that still kind of dicey?
I think it's good news. They say any publicity is good publicity. I don't think any news is good news, but we were getting no news prior. We don't even know what operation the guy got. He was off my board, but he just fell so far after pick 250 that I just kind of looked at him as my prospect in this draft, and I'm not going to hold any of the other prospects I picked up unless they make the opening day roster. But with Neto, I figured I would commit to hold him, and he's already got a proven track record, so I viewed him as kind of a better than prospect stash. I know Dave would say he may not be the same version of himself, and that's fair, but I thought it was worth a chance after 250.
Yeah, I think he's somebody who has been falling. He might stop falling now that we have a little bit more clear sense of his timeline, but he went 23 homers with 30 steals in his first full season. So you can see why people would want to get a piece of that if they're pretty sure he's going to have close to a full season this year. More injuries to talk about over the last few days. It is that time of year, of course. We've got Carlos Estevez dealing with lower back tightness. Now, as of right now, the news doesn't seem so bad. It sounds like the Royals still think there's time for Estevez to make 6 or 7 appearances later in camp. But does this news change how you'd value Estevez versus, say, Lucas Erceg behind him? Does this make you more interested in taking a shot on Erceg right away?
It does. It does, as a matter of fact. I remember it's different, but it reminds me last year, David Bednar had some minor injury issues and eventually was able to work himself into spring training game at the end of the season there. But he had an oblique issue and had a horrible season. It reoccurred on him. He wasn't ever right. I'm not saying that's going to happen with Estevez, but even these little minor injuries like Cutter Crawford's dealing with a knee issue, that can derail your season if you're not getting off to your typical start. So I would have to have him fall well past his ADP to go for him. And like you said, I am more interested in Erceg at this point.
Yeah, Lucas Erceg, who actually went several rounds before Estevez in the Glarf draft over the weekend, surprised everyone there. But maybe Michael Govier was onto something. Certainly a pitcher who seems to have higher upside, much better strikeout stuff. If Erceg were to be given the job, I think getting him at the end of the eighth round, where Michael did, makes a lot of sense. So we'll see if the story continues to trend in that direction. Like you said, even if it's just a minor issue right now, it throws off your spring prep, and then we're never really sure when you're back to your usual levels. You mentioned David Bednar there. We've got a little bit more news on him, which is that Pirates manager Derek Shelton said they're not ready to announce their closer the other day. Now, I think a lot of people were drafting David Bednar as pretty much the Pirates' unquestioned closer, despite that down year that you mentioned last year. Do you think this is just spring talk, or do you think there's something to this? Should we be moving Bednar down significantly?
That's a good question. I personally wouldn't move him down if you were a believer in him. You were likely focused on his career skills. Last year was a downturn in his control. He couldn't find the zone enough for him to be an effective player, and there were some tipping issues potentially as well. I think he's just kind of keeping the guys locked in, making them earn the spot, and that's, I think, all it is. But what do you think?
Yeah, I think that if I'm drafting today or in the next week or so, I do have to move Bednar down a little bit. But I'm pretty sure, like you said, making him earn the spot in a couple weeks, if Bednar has, good strikeout numbers, good walk numbers, etc., if he looks to be normal this spring, then it's not going to take many appearances for me to say, okay, yeah, I'm pretty sure he's going to be the guy. But if you're drafting right now and he hasn't had those appearances yet, I think you do have to consider that there's some chance that they're pretty worried. I mean, he was really nowhere near closer material
True.
last, so it's possible they know something we don't. Last bit of headlines here to touch on. We've got a couple of star infielders for the Orioles dealing with what I think are minor injuries, but I'm curious if you're worried about either of these. We had Gunnar Henderson exited the game today with side discomfort. He beat out a grounder and then made a leaping catch in the field. It's not clear if he tweaked something on one of those. But after the game, the Orioles said his removal was just precautionary. So I don't think we need to move him down the draft board. We also have Jordan Westberg, who hasn't played in several days. Last played Saturday. He's dealing with lower back soreness. Again, just soreness, maybe not that major of an issue. So are you moving either of these guys on your board at all if you're drafting in the next few days before we see them back on the field?
For Westberg, maybe move him down a round or so. It does feel better sometimes to select a player that doesn't have that designation at their current cost, unless you're a real huge believer. And I'm neutral on Westberg. I would be okay drafting him, but I'm not going above and beyond. As far as with Gunnar Henderson being an oblique issue, side issue, I would push him down some. This is definitely a spring training ramp up type injury. And at that top of the first round, you really don't want to screw it up. So I think Gunnar represents a bigger risk right now than Westberg.
Okay, that's fair enough. So even though all the talk is pretty mild, again, they're saying day to day, they're saying precautionary, it's just where it is on his body. You're worried that if it is an oblique, that's a pretty big deal. Is that what I'm hearing?
If I was doing an OC tonight, which I'm not, I can't take him at his average draft position inside that top 5, top 6. So just, you never know. I mean, that's how these things always start. They never start out with the guy missing, 6 to 8 weeks. It usually just incrementally gets worse typically.
True. Fair enough. And hey, if you're sitting there in that early mid first round, there's a whole bunch of other really, really good players. So maybe just take one of them. I can get behind that strategy, certainly. That does it for our headline portion of today's show. So we're going to move to the main topic, which is a review of this year's GLARF draft. GLARF is part of the Earth League. There are, it's 11 regional industry / experts leagues, whatever you want to call them. GLARF is the Great Lakes area one. We're all over the country and Canada as well. And GLARF is also the strongest, I think it's fair to say. We've won several years in a row now, which means as part of the Earth competition, there's a little charitable component. Everyone who enters any of the leagues gets to donate a little bit into the charity pot, which is won by the league who finishes collectively the highest in the overall contest. So all of the charity money gets to be donated to a charity of the winning league's choice. In our case, it was the Ruth Ellis Center, which supports LGBTQ young people in the city of Detroit. It was very cool to give them a nice big check. But onto the baseball, Lucas, you came into this draft as the defending champion. So I'm curious, how did you win last year? And did you sit down this year trying to do the exact same thing?
Yeah, funny you asked that because completely opposite strategy this year. Last year really hammered the pitching. I had Pablo Lopez on this roster, and he had somewhat of a down year to most people, but I went ahead and I packed on the pitching extremely heavily early. I had Pablo Lopez with Dylan Cease and Aaron Nola, as well as Raisel Iglesias. So even though Lopez's ERA was a lot worse than expected, having those other pitchers at the top of the rotation helped him, and he still provided the volume as far as the strikeouts. Mookie Betts in the first round last year, I think when he played was fine, but obviously missed time with the hand, and went with Ellie De La Cruz in the second round, which certainly was pretty solid. So that's kind of was the recipe there.
So you weren't necessarily sitting down with any sort of explicit intention, though, to recreate last year's success. You were taking this as its own draft, its own league, and a new year, etc.
Yeah, I was. I think the pitching pool is a lot different this season than last year. I think even in picks 70, 80, 90 to 100, there's pitchers in that range I think could be an SP2 this year. I didn't necessarily have that same feeling last year, although a guy like Cole Reagans certainly broke out. Dylan Cease, if he bought the dip last year, delivered ace status. So there's always those types of guys. But I think this year I'm going more on the hitting heavy side. So just a different year and looking at things a bit differently, I suppose.
Well, you say you're going on the hitting heavy side. You started your draft with not a hitter. You started your draft with Tarek Skubal. So I'm curious, did you target late in the draft to try to get a pitcher here, or was this just something that happened?
Funny you ask that here. As far as my first 5 selections that I was choosing, because I heard Jeff Erickson earlier this week with Scott Jenstead, 2 great podcasters. They were talking about that drop-off in that second round around pick 20. When Jeff said that, I completely agreed, and I thought about pick 20 was where I found that drop-off. So I had picks 10 and 11 as my first 2, with 12 and 9, and then pick 8. And then I had a few more picks, and then 14 was later, but it was still where you're able to get that premium second-round pick. So I was not disappointed when I got pick 14.
That's interesting because I've actually been avoiding the end of the draft just because the first round I see a little bit of a drop off after the first 8 or so. I guess if you're comfortable with Corbin Carroll, who's been jumping into that sometimes. For myself, I wanted to get either 3, the end of that first tier, where you can get either Judge, Ohtani, or Witt in most drafts, or I wanted the 8th pick because there's 5 guys who I view as close enough after that. That's where I ended up getting. But I had mostly just looked at that first round and thought, all right, I want to get one of those top 8 guys. And after that, I'm not so sure. But I'd agree with you. If you're looking at the second round and you're sitting in the back 5 spots or so, I do think that there is a drop-off in that area. So that makes some sense. So you were able to get 2 players from that tier, Tarek Skubal and Jackson Chourio. Is Chourio a particular target for you? Is he somebody who you think we're going to be drafting, maybe even front of the first round next year, a super talented 5-category superstar?
That's a great question. As far as a target, I have not had a draft pick in that back of the first yet. But it was really in between Chourio and Alvarez at my pick. With Chourio, it's just the chance that he can give you everything. Alvarez is guaranteed to not give you any steals. As far as his injury risk, I think it's somewhat there, but not too bad. I think it's semi-overblown. But with Chourio, it's just the fact that I was kind of trying to be greedy and just hoping for 5-category production. I think with him, it's really all about age to level. Just given how young he was and what he did, he could potentially be on that MVP level track, that superstar track. So he's not even 21 years old yet. So it's just seeing what he did last year and obviously hoping he can recreate it with the chance that he does more. I know last year or 3 years ago with Bobby Witt, he was around that 15-16 turn. And I believe his WRC plus wasn't even at 100, and some people were turned off by that. But that's kind of where you can get those superstar potential players, just really looking at like age to level.
Yeah, that's a great call out. I'm wondering, were you pushed a little bit more towards a 5-category guy like Chourio because you had a pitcher in round 1? Did you feel like I really just can't afford to have no steals from either of my first 2 rounds?
Yes, that's exactly right. Talking with a good friend of mine, Bob Osgood, doing some pre-draft prep, he was saying that if you do take that pitcher, you're going to want to get some bags Because if you start out with just a pure hitter without steals like Jordan or Vlad Jr., that you're going to be behind the 8 ball as far as your steals. Now, of course, you could say I'm behind the 8 ball in terms of my batting average, which is very fair. So you can't have it all. That's the benefit of 15 teamers and why they're so fun. But Bob was letting me know that he didn't think that Team 15, Jenny Butler, would select both Vlad Jr. and Jordan Alvarez. So that was a pretty strategic point that he had brought to my attention there, where one of them in theory would potentially fall because she probably wouldn't want to have 2 non-steals guys either.
Was there any thought to taking one of them and hoping you get Skubal in the early second, or was it always going to be Skubal at your number 1?
Well, it wasn't always going to be Skubal, funny enough, but I know that I would imagine Jenny would select a Skubal there because she had selected Wheeler on the 15-16 turn last year, and that was above his average draft position. So she's a pitcher-heavy person, typically. And with Skubal, I had thought a lot about the downside between him and Skeens this year. And then just the morning of preparing for the draft, these pitchers that we saw years ago, like Max Scherzer, Justin Verlander, Clayton Kershaw, it's not that hard for them to have that top 3, top 5 fantasy season if they can stay healthy for 30 turns and produce their typical thing. It's usually the cleanest path to a top tier finish is when those ace guys stay healthy and do what they do.
Yeah, for sure. So you've got a good chance at one in Skubal for sure. I want to quick ask you about my first 2 picks here before we move on to the next group of rounds. I went with Ellie De La Cruz from the 8th spot. My logic was I'll take the 8th spot, and whoever falls to me from that top 8, I'll be fine with. I'm not particularly surprised it was Ellie. He's maybe one of the riskier members of that top 8, but I think I'm okay with him at the 8th pick. He often goes a couple spots before that. Pairing him with Freddie Freeman in round 2, another player that some people are scared of. And we've got a comment here from Bizza Rizza Jizza saying, any concerns with the Freeman pick after hearing he may not play back-to-back games until the All-Star break, specifically day games following a night game? And this is somebody who's getting older, of course, battled high-profile injuries in the playoffs last year. Was I an idiot to take him in round 2? I noticed in one of the Earth Leagues, the person who drafted 8th, like me, also started with Freddie Freeman, and they got him in the 3rd round. So should I have waited?
No, I don't think so. As a matter of fact, one of the awesome things about Glarf Weekend is just talking about the different builds and different scenarios with people all weekend. Dave McDonald was saying, if you take an Ellie De La Cruz, you want to get a Freddie Freeman with him. It was the exact wording that he had said, and he pulled it off. So for Ellie, I think he's 4th on my board. I mean, you could theoretically select him ahead of Judge. I probably wouldn't do it, but if I had multiple Judge shares and I wanted to diversify, there's nothing wrong with it, because I think with Ellie, this guy is 1st overall. I mean, potentially could be that number 1 player. So to have an elite batting average asset and a guy that pretty much has never busted over the last 10 years plus with Freeman, I think it's a perfect pairing. And once Freeman shows that he's playing in these Cactus League games, I could see his ADP go up closer to 16 when people are focused on average this year more than ever.
All right. Well, I like to hear it. I was somewhat nervous about it when I made the pick, but part of the logic was, as you said, I think he was a perfect balance with Ellie De La Cruz. So I'm happy to hear that you feel the same. Anything other notable picks in the first couple rounds by any of our league mates you want to point out before we move on to the next section?
Yeah. I mean, there was a lot of somewhat standard picks just because people were taking, the value that was there. Jordan Alvarez to Team 13, Sarah Sanchez. Josh Hader to Matty Wood at 4. Some people might look at that and think, wow, that's high 2nd round for Hader. Well, he's my number 1 closer as far as fantasy this season. And Blake Snell's potentially going to go in the 2nd round in some of the live events, and Hader could go in the 3rd round. So if you just kind of flip the 2, he really didn't leave that much meat on the bone. So I have no issues with that since you're getting that early 3rd round pick anyways.
Yeah, no other closer went until pick 6 of the 3rd round, Edwin Diaz, and then Emmanuel Clase went 5 picks after that. So Maddie may have been able to get Hader, I think, in the 3rd round. But if you're really a Hader guy and you're pretty sure you're also a Snell guy and you think he is going to be there, then, well, it certainly worked out if that was his plan. Moving on to the next chunk of rounds, we're going to deal with them in little groups here. I'm going to talk about rounds 3 through 6, where you, Lucas, went and grabbed your first closer, Devin Williams, and then you added 3 hitters, O'Neill Cruz, Salvador Perez, and Jose Altuve. 3 hitters who are rather different from each other. You got one young superstar, potential superstar in O'Neill Cruz, who we still don't know how good he is yet. And you've got 2 of the older players who are going in these first 6 rounds in Perez and Altuve. I can imagine the main thing you were thinking about in this stage of the draft was just make sure you're mostly focusing on hitters because you got that starter in round 1.
That's exactly right. And with O'Neill Cruz, he's semi-unproven as far as living up to this draft cost. But yeah, I mean, I was just kind of looking at the upside as far as what could go right, just given his skill set. But I'm not like uber confident that it'll happen just because, like I said, there's no guaranteed track record. I felt a little stupid passing on Chris Sale there, who you landed. I mean, it could be looking really bad to allow him to go to the middle of the 4th round if he can post a good 27-30 starts for you.
Yeah, this was the part of the draft where I was already starting to get a couple interesting values. William Contreras fell to me in the middle of the 3rd round, which I think was just about as late as he's been going in the last 2 weeks. I'm not a early catcher guy necessarily. I'm not sure if the gap between Contreras and the rest of the field needs to be that early, but I'm pretty sure if he's fallen that far, I think I had to grab him. Would you have grabbed him around that range if you were me?
I absolutely would have. There's plenty of players that I would have selected him over that he went ahead of. So, yeah, I mean, even if he regresses 10, 15%, he's going to be so far and away ahead of almost every catcher. That's the thing with the catching pool this year. I know that there's some intriguing younger guys that could emerge later on. I know Dave McDonald grabbed one, Agustin Ramirez. But at the same time, it's like the tight end position in football. We always get excited about these little intriguing players, and it's usually the same handful of players that are far and away better than everyone else.
And you did manage to grab one of those in this round in Sal Perez. I'll mention your 7th round pick as well because he's also a catcher, Cal Raleigh. Are you someone who's trying to get 2 of the top 8 to 10 catchers, or is that just how it fell this time?
Kind of how it fell. I was drafting next to some very tough drafters with Sarah Sanchez and Jenny Butler, and we were saying, next to this person or that person. There's nobody in this draft that I feel quote unquote comfortable drafting next to because everyone in here is very good. But at times there was just enough players that came back to me where Jenny couldn't take away everyone that I wanted. So that was kind of nice. But there was other times where I felt a bit stumped too. So that was just the nature of a snake draft where those 2 catchers just kind of fell to a spot where I felt pretty good about it.
All right, and rounding out my picks in this range, I got Lawrence Butler in the 5th, a buzzy player who I'm on. Are you a Lawrence Butler guy as well, or do you think the buzz has gone a little far?
No, I think that's a fine price. Last year he obviously showed that his skill set is very legitimate. Now he could come back a little bit and still be a very useful option, and he could also go the other way where he elevates his skill set. So I think he's shown enough where that middle of that 5th round is good, and it's somewhat of a hitter desert because he could potentially give you 5 category production versus some other hitters in that range are just not going to do that, like Vientos, Christian Walker, Kyle Schwarber. I think Doyle isn't necessarily a pure hitter in my mind, so I think that range for Butler, it's kind of draft dynamics where he's the next name on the list where people feel really thrilled to select him.
Yeah, I don't view Butler as that different from a bunch of the young power speed options in round 4, say O'Neill Cruz, who you got, or James Wood or Wyatt Langford. I think I'm fine with Butler going after those guys, but I'm also fine grabbing Butler after those guys. I'm totally happy with Chris Sale in the 4th and one of those players in the 5th. I also did grab Kyle Schwarber in the 6th. He went about a round after Brent Rooker and Marcell Ozuna. I view all 3 of those guys as completely adequate options. Would you have been open to blocking off your GH spot if the opportunity came, or are you not ready to take those guys just yet?
I was looking at them if a catcher didn't come back to me. With Sal Perez coming back to me, I get that there's aging risk as well as O-swing risk and all that, but I feel good enough about him where I was okay with it since catcher is a tough position to fill. But if, let's say, Ozuna or Rooker fell to me, I would have had to think about it since they're such a big bat. It's not clogging your utility spot when these guys are giving you 35 plus bombs and playing cleanup every day.
Right, not exactly a clog, or if it is a clog, it's the good kind of clog. I'm not really sure if we want to continue this metaphor, but any other interesting picks in these rounds? We could note team number 1, Michael Govier here, with the Ronald Acuna in round 3 and then Jacob deGrom in round 4 pairing. Although that's pretty late for Jacob deGrom. I think this
That's
was
true.
a room full of people who were pretty scared. I was looking at him or Chris Sale in round 4, but I'd rather take Chris Sale. I think they're both elite and both major risks, but I think there's less of a risk with Sale.
Agreed.
And I don't know, would it have been absolutely insane of me to pair Sale with deGrom if deGrom came back? Probably. That's probably dumb, but do you like deGrom where he went there?
Not a deGrom guy. He's had a lot of missed time, as we know. He hasn't pitched over 100 innings in like 5 years. And I get that he has a healthy elbow with the Tommy John surgery. But at the end of the day, he's going to be 37 in the middle of this summer. He's had other ailments such as shoulder, back, neck. For me, I just can't do it. That being said, I can see the upside, but there's just too much risk.
And do you think that the deGrom team should also be the Ronald Acuna team? As somebody who's willing to take on risks, saying, you know what, this is a risky team. I'm just going to own it. I've already crossed the threshold of an uncomfortable level, so I might as well get a whole lot of talent? Or do you think that the person who drafts Jacob deGrom better be extremely cautious with all his other early picks because he's got Jacob deGrom?
Yeah, I think you're compiling too much risk when you do something like that. Now, if deGrom were to fall extremely far, there's a certain point where I think he's worth a chance. Maybe obviously in the 6th round, he's probably worth it. But even in the 5th round, he's worth a chance. But then you're going to want to bolster him with safe and steady options, not with a guy who could not be in game action until May or so.
Yeah, I guess to be fair, Michael did have Logan Gilbert as his first starter. That's pretty much as safe and steady as it gets. So if you are going to have deGrom, having him as an SP2 behind a player like that's
fair.
A decent way to do it. But, it's Jacob deGrom, and you've paired him with Ronald Acuna and Luis Robert in the next round. So there's certainly a lot of bust potential there. Could go either extreme, I would say.
One other interesting pick I wanted to get your take on, Eric. In that 6th round, Spencer Schwellenbach went. Obviously, he's a popular player these days. What are your thoughts on him?
Yeah, I think he is interesting. I think that starts to feel a little early, but let's see. The pitchers going right after him in the same round, Hunter Brown, Tanner Bybee, Shota Imanaga. I mean, these are all guys who we've seen be good, but not for very long. So if you're willing to trust them, I think that range is not so bad. I think I can get behind that enough. He's somebody who I think has been getting some buzz, right? He's been moving up. And so is this where he's moving up to, or is he going to continue moving? I don't know if I would go much beyond this, but I think he's a good pitcher. And if you're taking him in the range of good young pitchers who aren't quite proven yet, but got to just assume that their 1 year is who they are, it seems like he's going near pitchers who are similar to him. I mean, he is going pretty close, though, to pitchers who are more proven, like that Garrett Cole, Pablo Lopez, Bailey Ober run in the previous round. So I'm not sure if I see a lot more room for him to move up, but for Schwellenbach fans, I think that's probably an acceptable enough spot. Are you one of those Schwellenbach fans?
That's a tough price just because he has got to come through for you there. Similar feeling with Wyatt Langford. I get that there's a lot of excitement in that, 3rd, 4th round. And, he had a big second half, but there's very little margin for error. Even though there is upside, I'll certainly give you that. But with Schwellenbach, I just think that I can find a safer player there and then find a pitcher that I like, a couple rounds later. But he could certainly pay that spot off and then some.
Yeah, I think I might prefer some of the other guys in that same round, but I think he's going in the right tier. I think that's how I'd put it. Let's move on to the next 4 rounds or so, round 7 through 10, where you, as I mentioned, got Cal Raleigh. And then at that point, through 7 rounds, you had 5 hitters, a starter, and a closer. So I imagine you were definitely trying to get probably 2 to 3 more pitchers, and you did. You got Max Fried, Sonny Gray, and then Kenley Jansen. Kenley Jansen means you're done with saves with him and Williams. You've got 2 guys who are unquestioned locks, so got to be pretty happy with that. Max Fried and Sonny Gray, you're not scared of Max Fried having some forearm issues and then not getting surgery? You think he's going to be fine?
I am a little scared. That being said, I didn't sign him to a 7-year deal, so that's something
True.
there. But, at this range where he fell and just based on what he's done for his career, I thought it was worth it after pick 100. I did have a chance between him and Freddie Peralta, so I may regret that since I love Freddie Peralta this year with the big strikeouts. But yeah, I mean, with Fried, he's healthy today. Obviously, the Yankees gave him that huge deal. You would think in theory they did their due diligence, but maybe they didn't. So there is some risk there, but I thought after pick 100, it was baked into the cost.
Yeah, you took him right after Aaron Nola, right before Freddie Peralta, who you mentioned, as well as Grayson Rodriguez and Logan Webb. There was a little run of starters there. And then I went to Hunter Green a few picks after that. And Hunter Green is someone who I've been landing a lot, which must mean other people don't like him. Do you think this was too early for Hunter Green? Too much risk baked in? Would you have taken him if he was still on the board in round 9?
Yeah, if that was the pitcher that fell to me, then I would have been happy to select him because this is a good pocket as far as pitchers goes, I think. You have Joe Ryan in that pocket, Logan Webb, Grayson Rodriguez, Freddie Peralta, Max Fried, Aaron Nola, Hunter Green. This is a great place to get your SP2. And if you want to go with your SP3 here, there's nothing wrong with that if you're going pitching heavy. So I like the Green grab. His talent is so immense. I mean, he is just a phenomenal talent. It's a tough park to beat, but as your SP2, I mean, if he provides 200 plus Ks for you in decent ratios, then he should earn that back.
Yeah, I'm hoping for an incredible strikeout start between him and Chris Sale. I always want my first 2 guys to be very much strikeout heavy because strikeouts are the most predictable pitcher stat, right? Way more reliable year to year than ERA, whip, or wins. So I'm willing to be ahead on strikeouts and behind in the others early. Both of us grabbed both of our SP2 and 3 in this range. Like I mentioned, you got Fried and Gray. I got Hunter Green and Jack Flaherty, who's another one of my guys this year. Is he one of your guys as well, or am I on an island?
No, at a certain point, if he were to fall, I would be interested in him. I think his landing spot in Detroit was good because I think that's going to be a nice division to have your pitchers play in. That's why a guy like Joe Ryan, Pablo Lopez look even more appealing because they're going to get cupcake matchups against certain teams, and it's going to be cold weather there longer than the Western teams. So I think Flaherty going there is solid. It's all about his breaking balls as far as his ability to succeed. But with Chris Fetter, premium pitching coach, he's gotten a lot out of Flaherty in the past, and I think it's a solid range for him.
So I also grabbed my first closer in this range back in round 7, Tanner Scott. It sounds like he's actually somewhat surprisingly going to get the majority of the saves. I say surprisingly, maybe other people were expecting it. I thought the Dodgers would continue with more of a committee, but they're certainly making noises as if Scott is the guy. But I'm curious about this whole range of closers because this is the range where you're already kind of out of the sure things, or you've got sure things who are only, medium talents at this point. Kenley Jansen, no longer an elite reliever, I don't think. At least that's how I think about him. But we had Scott to me in the 7th round. And then in the 8th round, we had just Lucas Erceg, who we talked about earlier, which was a surprise, but we might start seeing him here again if Estevez is hurt. Then in round 9, it was Trevor McGill, Jeff Hoffman, Pete Fairbanks, and David Bednar. And then you came in at the end of that run in early round 10 with Kenley Jansen. Alexis Diaz also went at the very end of round 10. So a whole bunch of closing options here for people who waited on closer like me or who want to get a second still acceptable closer. Would you have taken Jansen over some of the guys before, or were you pretty much just thinking, all right, I'm going to wait until this tier is basically done and then I'll get whoever's there?
Yeah, I was semi-monitoring it as far as, the supply of everything. I've heard Dave McDonald's over the years say that he likes to grab his first closer like semi-early, and then that way he doesn't feel as much pressure to get one if they fall. He can just select one if he feels like that's the no other standing out values to him because he's not as desperate as he's already acquired the one closer. So that was kind of somewhat my plan. I think the teams 11 through 15, you're able to get one of those premium closers in that either third or fourth round. And in a 15 league, there's nothing wrong with that. 15-team league, there's nothing wrong with that. So as far as, if it would have been Bednar that would have fell, or another one of those closers that you had mentioned, I would have given them a look, but I just kind of saw them start to dry up pretty quickly and was debating between Tristan Casas and Kenley Jansen. So I might regret that if Casas goes off with 30 home run season.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about Casas, who was my 10th round pick here, but it sounds
Mm-hmm.
like I might already have your answer. The 10th round was right before we were about to take a break. We took breaks after rounds 10 and 20, so I knew I was about to get a chance to step back and reassess. And I thought that I was going to probably take my second closer there. It would have probably been Alexis Diaz, or I don't know, Jordan Romano and Carlos Estevez went in that next round. But then Casas was falling. And I'm not a super Tristan Casas guy, but I'm definitely not against him. And I just figured it was time. And this is even though I already had a first baseman. Is that a consideration at all in round 10? I grabbed my second first baseman before I grabbed either a second baseman or a third baseman, for example. And at the time, I was wondering, was that a minor tactical error, or do you think that's totally fine and I should just take the value because Casas fell?
I think it's a take the value situation. As an experienced drafter, you shouldn't have any worries about that because you've done a lot of drafts. You know the player pool, you know how to pivot, and you also know that first base is weak. So there's nothing wrong with loading that up. Now, if you were filling in your fourth or fifth outfield spot by, the seventh round or eighth round, that might be a little bit of a different story because you're going to leave yourself just so thin everywhere else. But filling in your corner infield spot in round 10 with a potentially premium power bat, nothing wrong with that.
All right. Well, I'm glad you agree. That's the side that I ended up coming down on, but I wasn't so sure about it. I even considered, say, Tyler Glasnow in that spot as well. I'm not sure if it was going to fit my team. I already had a slightly risky rotation that's pretty strikeout heavy, but he was falling. He ended up going 3 picks after me. And I do want to mention the team he went to. He went to Aaron Cummings' team, and Aaron started with 8 straight hitters.
Yeah.
And then right after that, he went Justin Steele and Tyler Glasnow. Now, if you started extremely heavy like that, is that an argument for or against getting somebody like Glasnow? Because Glasnow, you're getting him in the 10th round, and I think we all know if somehow this is the year where he barely misses any starts, I mean, he could be a second-round pick. And so are you shooting for that low floor, high ceiling guy if you are behind in starting pitching? Or are you saying, wait a second, I'm behind in starting pitching, and if Glasnow goes down in April, I'm even more behind. I can't afford to take him. I have to prioritize safety. Would you lean to either direction if you've had such an extreme hitter-heavy start like Aaron did?
My mindset went to safety when you're asking me the question. But looking at those pitchers in that range, who's truly safe that's going to deliver an impact performance? I mean, you could say Christopher Sanchez is safe, but he's more of the SP4 safe. He's not front of the rotation. So I think that as far as what he did, going for that Glasnow grab, I think it's fine. That being said, it is not for the faint of heart, as we all know.
Right. But, players like Tyler Glasnow, these really risky players who, have extremes in their profile in whatever direction it is, they do still belong on someone's team. And maybe this is the team. So maybe we were both right to pass on him, but Aaron was absolutely still correct to take him exactly where he did. As I mentioned, we took a break after round 10, and we're going to take a break here for a message from our sponsor, Fantrax. Fantrax is the most customizable fantasy platform in the industry, offering the greatest fantasy experience for your dynasty, keeper, redraft, and best ball leagues. Coming from another service, Fantrax makes it easy. Fantrax can import any of your current leagues and customize if needed. Fantrax offers the most in-depth player pool in the industry, including minor league players. Do you need a customizable commissioner service for your fantasy league? Fantrax offers more customization than any other platform. Waivers, categories, scoring systems, schedule. Fantrax offers custom solutions for all that and more. And it's all free. Sign up for free today and be entered to win an official MLB signed jersey from Vladimir Guerrero Jr. Simply go to fantrax.com/RotoWire and sign up today. That's fantrax.com/RotoWire. Fantrax, the home of fantasy sports. We're also brought to you by Edge Boost. Have you ever had your debit card declined or had to call your bank at 3 a.m. in Vegas? Edge Boost is the first consumer-facing online bank dedicated to the gaming industry. There are numerous benefits to using Edge Boost. $250,000 per day in debit deposits, unlimited withdrawals, cash back on sports betting, DFS, sweeps, deposit $25, get $25, 100% approval for all gaming activity, financial segmentation for discretion and responsible gaming, compatible today for prediction markets, iCasino, DFS, sports betting, lottery, brick and mortar casinos, horse racing, and sweeps. No transaction reviews or account freezes. Visit edgeboost.bet today and use promo code ROTOPOD. That's promo code ROTOPOD. And welcome back, everybody, to the RotoWire Fantasy Baseball Podcast. Erik Halterman here with Lucas Beery. We've been going over the Glarf Draft Board, a 15-team mixed roto league, part of the Earth leagues that we drafted in Detroit on Saturday. Not only in Detroit, actually, we drafted in the Tigers Stadium. We should shout out our Detroit area hosts, Aaron Cumming, Marty Tallman, and Michael Govier was somehow setting that up. Definitely the coolest place I have ever drafted in or will ever draft in again, I would say. How about you?
Absolutely. That was a dream come true. So those guys are heroes for getting that done.
Yep, pretty remarkable. Highly recommend if your league can somehow get a in-person draft. That's the main thing. Just so much more fun to be, discussing the draft with people in the room right after it happens. And man, if you can get that in-person league to draft in a MLB stadium, why not? That was definitely a highlight of the winter. Moving on to the next set of rounds here. Let's get a few more all together. Let's do the next 6 all in one. And just to recap where you were heading into these rounds, you had 5 hitters, 3 starters, and 2 closers. So pretty balanced, maybe a little bit pitcher heavy, if anything.
Mm-hmm.
In these next 6 rounds, you grabbed 4 hitters and 2 starting pitchers. You went Mason Wynn, Ryan Pepio, Michael Tolia, Brandon Nimmo, Jorge Soler, and Shane Baz. So what are some things you were thinking about in this part of the draft? Were you pretty happy with, say, your category balance, your position balance, your risk versus safety balance? I think this is the type of draft where you really start knowing what your team has and trying to patch up the holes before you get into the real dregs of the draft pool.
Yeah, really was honestly focusing on best player available. That's why a guy like Brandon Nimmo ended up on the team. Plantar fasciitis-wise, I'm not too worried, although it is somewhat of a concern. But a guy like him, top of the lineup on a budding lineup with Juan Soto, it just seems like the kind of that's going to earn the money back. So yeah, I viewed there as a really sweet pitching pocket that I think is excellent around pick 190 to 210, where you're looking at players such as Tanner Houck, Nathan Uvalde, that range there. I just thought it was Zach Eflin. Nick Pivetta was previously in that range. He'll move up more than likely, but that's a range where I think you can find some excellent pitchers, and there's somewhat of a drop-off after that. So I wanted to try to pepper that range a little bit, and there was some absolute fallers in that range that caught my eye, and you picked one of them up with Kodai Senga. I was viewing him and Shane Baz pretty close, and I wasn't sure which way to go, but I feel like, 220s, 230s to get one of those 2 players as a pitcher in a 15-team league, I thought it was worth it.
Yeah, I am not a Senga guy in the abstract, but that was several rounds after ADP, about 50 picks or something like that. I think it was even beyond his max by quite a bit, or at least his recent max, I think, when I was looking it up. And so are you somebody who you'll take those gifts, even if he's not a player that you particularly like? You're not a cross guys off your draft board type of drafter. I mean, I'm certainly not. And the end result is sometimes I let the rest of the room draft my team effectively, and I end up with guys who I don't actually like. But hey, if none of you like him, I guess I'll take him. Is that a good way to draft?
I think from time to time it's okay. The thing is you don't want to end up in your biggest leagues and have all the players that you've never had before. That's True. A bad feeling. That happened to me in Glarf in my first year. We did it as a live event. I had none of the players I drafted prior, and I've heard Matt Modica say that you don't want to end up at your live events with all new players because it's not a good sign. But no, I think for a guy like Senga, with where he fell it's a conservative room typically in Glarf, and the types of players that will fall, those guys with the Dr. Dave injury-prone tag potentially.
Right.
So, yeah, I thought that was an excellent grab there. And just based on the strikeouts alone, I mean, he's got to be the highest projected strikeout pitcher that went after pick 200, I would imagine.
Yeah, I would think so. It's just, is he going to be healthy enough to get
Sure.
those strikeouts? And even in his rookie year, he was walking a Blake Snell level of batter. So I'm not even sure how good he is, but I'm willing to take that chance at that point. I think in round 16, if he were to just blow up and give me nothing, I'm already okay enough. You
Hmm.
mentioned it's a conservative draft room. I would agree. And so I go into the draft knowing that if I'm willing to take whoever falls to me, I'm probably going to have a slightly risky team, and I just have to decide I'm more or less okay with that. Do you make any adjustments yourself, knowing that the room you're entering is going to be on the more conservative side?
I sort of did. A lot of NFBC minds in this league, as well as industry folks, and a lot of people I know here believe in the heavy catcher approach, the heavy closer approach, fill in the rest of the things, not only by streaming the hitters, but by waiting on the hitters and loading up on the pitching. Now, it's interesting because Dave McDonald, he said that he felt like there was tons of pitching values, which I do agree with, but you don't want to wait on pitching necessarily in a tough room like this. There might be room for one or two teams to do that if they're in the right draft spot. I think Aaron came out with a pretty competitive team, so I liked what he did there waiting on it. But pitching is going to be really hard to get off waivers in a 15 team like this. We lamented over that in our group chat last year, and it's just one of those things where you don't want to fall too far behind on the pitching, I guess, is my biggest takeaway.
Yeah, I grabbed 3 pitchers in this range. I got 2 starters, Senga, who you mentioned, and also Yusei Kikuchi, who has been a target of mine. I
Mm-hmm.
think he took the steps forward last year. I hate his landing spot in LA, but he was one of the best pitchers in baseball last year in terms of strikeout minus walk rate, which is one of the best stats to look at. I also got my second and third baseman here in Bryson Stott and Michael Garcia. And I grabbed my second closer. I think Justin Martinez is somebody I saw as the last guy who I think I'm pretty confident saying will be a closer. And judging by the fact that no other closers went for 3 rounds, I think that the rest of the room probably feels that way. Liam Hendricks is the next reliever, and he went at around 16.
I
So you
love
buy
that.
Justin Martinez? Yeah, do you like him there?
I love that stab there, and I think I can't name a single free agent reliever that would come in and knock him off that perch as the number one man, assuming he's looking good with his control. Um, this is the type of profile I do feel like that could elevate into a top 10 closer, just based on how nasty he is and just the fact that he's been able to be so good at a young age. He can still learn things, develop. So yeah, even if David Robertson were to sign there, he doesn't scream capital C closer to me for Robertson. So I think Martinez's stock is moving up now that the musical chairs are being filled on the closer side.
Yeah, that's how I felt too. I think that
Hmm.
he belonged in this tier of I'm pretty sure he's a closer guys
Hmm.
rather than the well maybe he's a closer guys. The only real threat to Martinez I think is AJ Puck who went in round 17. So early second closer stab there I would say. Should we move on to the next chunk of rounds here unless there's any other interesting picks some of our league mates made that you want to highlight in rounds 11 through 16?
Yeah, I guess I'll just ask you a quick question. This is a bit of an interesting one. There are certain pitchers in this range that were selected that are just going to flat out regress a lot from last year. Looking at players like Seth Lugo or Ronaldo Lopez, you just know for a fact that it's going to be nearly impossible for them to repeat, and their underlying skills are not necessarily elite or anything. How would you kind of treat those players? Because I've been in leagues where those guys have fallen, and to be honest, I don't necessarily know what to do with them myself.
Yeah, I might view those 2 specific guys you mentioned pretty differently. I still view Lugo as a totally fine, boring option, and there's going to be rooms where people look too much at his results last year, and you won't be able to draft him in the totally fine, boring rotation filler range. But as long as you can get him there,
Hmm.
I mean, he's somebody who had a 3 ERA, but his Sierra was 394. So you just got to draft him near the other guys who are going to produce a high 3s ERA. and not a particularly exciting strikeout rate. So is that the range where he went? He went in round 13 to Mark Gannon, right before Nathan Eovaldi, right before Luis Heel and Taj Bradley. So if you want certainty, if that's as long as that's all you're thinking you're getting there, and you're not getting a repeat of last year's numbers, you're just getting an innings eater. That's fine to me. Lopez is a little different. I think Lopez is more of a higher risk, high reward option, and he's somebody I could see the price getting too exciting on or too early in some drafts, but obviously he's nowhere near his 199 ERA, but 358 Sierra. He had a high strikeout rate, unlike Lugo. So he's somebody I'm still interested in. But I think, as you mentioned, those, the fact that they dramatically outperform their ERA estimators means that there's some leagues where they're just going to go earlier. But I think I'm still willing to take either of them. I don't think the price was too crazy on both of them. Or would you have taken some of those guys who went in that next round, or even the round after? We had Brandon Woodruff, Mackenzie Gore, Clark Schmidt, Tanner Houck, Nick Lodolo. There's not a lot of, sure things who are really good. This is the region of the draft, right?
That's what I was thinking. I mean, you pretty much hit it as far as there are no sure things. And even when we looked at the Tyler Glasnow pick, around 150 overall, that's not going to happen in almost any league other than a conservative veteran-laden league like a Galarf. So, it just all is about how you like to draft. If you like to take some risks here and there and live life on the edge, I think a Tyler Glasnow's fine. But if you like to go with the more conservative pitchers, I think sometimes that's fine too. So it's really all about how you play, since it's your fantasy team coming up this year.
All right, let's move on to the next chunk of rounds. Let's talk about 17 through let's go 17 through 23, the rest of the active rounds, where you, Lucas, went Zach Neto, Jung-Hoo Lee, Kirby Yates, TJ Friedel, Jeimer Candelario, Carlos Santana, and Lucas Giolito. That's your third closer in there, Kirby Yates. Is that something you do often? Do you normally draft 2.5 closers, or do you normally stick with just 2?
Last year, I actually emerged out of this league with 1 closer out of the draft because I took a couple specs, and they were bad process picks, man. Last year, I took Matt Brash as kind of a half closer, and then I took Robert Stevenson as a mystery in Los Angeles. So they both blew their arms out before the season even started, so I didn't have to carry half closers in a fab league, it's tough. I don't know what's going to happen as far as Yates, holding him, but falling to the 19th round, I thought it was worth a chance.
So the fact that you drafted Yates, does that mean you think I was dumb to draft Tanner Scott in round 7 where I did?
No, not necessarily. Yates was just a product of him falling so much that I figured I'd get a preview of the usage patterns, and at worst, I'll be able to hold him for 3, 4, 5 weeks as a ratio protector. And if he's just not getting any saves, he can be safely dropped at that time. But this team could win so many games that there could be so many save opportunities. I think even if Scott gets you 25 saves with nearly 100 strikeouts in the premium ratios, I think you're sitting pretty.
Just taking a look at some of the positions of the hitters that you got in this round. Were you waiting on a third baseman all the way until Jeimer Candelario, or am I missing somebody who has dual eligibility that I'm not noticing? I'm seeing your corner in general. You had Michael Tolia in round 13, and then Jeimer Candelario in round 21, and Carlos Santana in round 22. Is there somebody up there that I'm missing?
No, there's not. And with Yates falling to the 19th round, that was past his typical average draft position, and TJ Friedel dropped past his position. And I would have taken Joey Ortiz if it wasn't for those 2 droppers. And I was just praying that he would come back to me. Well, it turns out not only was I hoping he'd come back to me, but Sarah Sanchez and Jenny Butler were eyeing him up too. So Joey Ortiz is one of those guys where there's a lot of sharp players focusing in on him. And with Candelario, he was my last acceptable option between Ortiz, Candelario, as well as Ryan McMahon and Connor Norby. So I was definitely white-knuckling during the entire second break for third base.
Well, you're one of those sharp players, and I guess I'm not if I wasn't particularly on Joey Ortiz. I think he's fine, so sell me on him. What am I missing here? I see a guy who plays good defense and has a league average bat, but managed 11 homers and 11 steals in basically a full season last year. Looks like the epitome of just a guy who I'd want in those NL only leagues where the playing time's important, but who I really could care less about in a 15 team mixed league. So what's the appeal here?
Yeah, with Ortiz, there's not going to be one absolute number that's just going to wow you with him. I just think he has a good skill set across the board. Strikes out 20% of the time, walks 11% of the time. Last year, he gave a double-double in his first full season in the majors, and he's going to have potentially dual eligibility. If he can just uptick a little bit, you're looking at a 15-15 guy with potentially a decent average. So yeah, I don't think that it's necessarily going to be like a 2020 guy, but I just think he could potentially fill up a lot of categories with CI and MI, and it's going to be a second season, so there's a chance for growth.
That is the type of player that I think I myself can often miss, and I'm sure there's other drafters who are in a similar boat. The guys who just they contribute everywhere, but they really don't do anything notable anywhere, so you don't notice them. They can certainly be helpful as one of the last people on your active roster. So maybe I should move Joey Ortiz up my board. What I was doing in this range was mostly just drafting an entire outfield. I only had one outfielder, I believe, in the first 17 rounds. I had an early Lawrence Butler, but I was really trying to fill up the infield spots. And so that meant that, well, I grabbed Carlos Correa to start this range, and then Jesus Sanchez, Byron Buxton, Joe Adell, David Festa, one more starter, and then Matt Vierling and John Kenzie Noel. Can't say I'm too excited about all those outfielders, Byron Buxton particularly, although he was somebody who fell, so I figured I guess might as well. If you're in a position where you're stuck taking this many outfielders in this range of the draft, is that evidence that you did something slightly wrong earlier, or do you think this is fine?
No, I think you hit it before it starts to get too bad, especially by getting the three of Sanchez, Buxton, and Adell. I think those players have a projectable floor that's good with the potential ceiling for a little bit more, especially with Buxton on the power side, and even Adell too, a guy that's similar to Ortiz, still gaining some experience, which we can't overlook that. So yeah, I think that you hit it at a good time. If you would have went for it a little bit later, I think it gets a lot more seedy, but I think you pretty much got it before the last call, I guess.
And I think I did make sure that my utility guy was an outfielder too, just so I had some volume there, figuring that well, at least one of those guys is going to come up well short, probably. Any interesting picks from our league mates in these last few active rounds before we move on to the reserves?
Yeah, just the pitching that went in this range. I mean, this is what shows you how tough the drafters are in Glarf as far as gobbling up that pitching. It was hard to find pitchers that I felt excited about, and I don't want to say I had to reach on anybody, but I just found the hitters a little bit more interesting. Maybe that was more of that draft champions mindset of attacking the plate appearances. And I missed out on a lot of these pitchers while the shrewd drafters were hammering those SPs in rounds 22, 23, and beyond. So that's just an interesting theme if you're in your draft to pound that pitching depth because it's crucial in a 15-team league.
Yeah, several pitchers who are getting some buzz, like, say, the two Holmeses. They went to Dave McDonald in back-to-back rounds, Grant in the 19th and Clay in the 20th. I believe that's a decent ways ahead of where they were going. Once you get into this range of the draft, though, is this already the time where you're almost considering throwing out ADPs, particularly in a sharp room where everybody else knows about the buzzy players too? Is it just time to say, you know what, I don't care at all where this guy is going in other drafts? He's the best player on the board. I'm going to grab him.
I sort of did that around about round 21, round 22 with the corner infielders that I kept thankfully sniping Dave McDonald on. That was a pleasure. But yeah, I mean, at this point, whenever I was grabbing Lucas Giolito, he was kind of one of the guys that I felt like maybe has upside. Maybe he, is a shell of himself too. But at a certain point, like you said, you do have to throw out ADP, and mine's closer to round 22 or so. Maybe other people do it a lot sooner, but yeah.
All right, so let's move on to the reserve rounds here. And real quick, do you have a general reserve round strategy? Is there a bench setup that you want? Are you a 5 pitchers, 2 hitters, 6 pitchers, 1 hitter? Is there any particular setup that you say, I'm going to do this unless the draft gives me something else, or do you keep it pretty open ended?
Usually relatively open-ended. I oftentimes base it on what I've built up to that point. Now, that being said, the back end of my rotation, I believe, is weak. So I should have pounded that pitching a little bit better, but I think everyone else had the same idea. And as a result of that, I think I went with more of a hitting heavy approach, but just kind of whatever the draft gives me, as well as trying to bolster up some needs when I can. But I think one thing I've learned a little bit over the last few years is to target upside. Don't just target a guy because you need a third, second baseman, or you need a seventh outfielder to feel cozy and safe, because these guys are going to be dropped. They're going to be churned through. This is your chance to attack that guy who could cost a lot in fab for the early drafters. Let's say the drafters that went in January or December in a fab league. This is your chance to target that guy who could be a high dollar fab addition.
Yeah, I'd say looking at some of the benches around the league, I think Dave McDonald, who we just mentioned a couple times, did that pretty well in his
Mm-hmm.
reserve rounds. He's got Luis Angel Acuna, Caleb Durbin, Augustine Ramirez, a bunch of young talents who people will be bidding on in the first fab period in some leagues. Might as well just start with them on your team. And then if they don't make the team, those boring players that you chose not to draft in round 30 are still going to be there.
Lot,
Let's look at,
lot,
yeah.
there's some other examples, like you did a great job of that with Kobe Mayo. One piece of news, and he's going to be drafted in all formats, including 10-team leagues potentially. So Christian Moore, another good example. He's a Los Angeles Angels second base prospect with excellent power upside. So just that, looking for the upside is, I think, key. But yeah, I just wanted to point that out in that reserve round.
Yeah, more in that last round to Mark Gannon. Said one burrito to Jake Hallisker, who would know the Guardians' chances of calling up one burrito at the start of the season.
And
So evidently, there's at least some of a chance, right?
looking at Jake's reserves, clearly a very experienced veteran drafter. The pitching that he went on, as far as from DJ Hers all the way down to Tristan McKenzie, and just pounded the pitching. So it just goes to show you he's looking for 2 hits, maybe. He wants 2 of those players to hopefully hit, and he's taking some pretty good darts in the process. So definitely an example of a veteran drafter. He's going to have the entire spring training to evaluate those players' stats as well as rotation status, and definitely a solid strategy.
Would you push even more in that direction in drafts that happen, say, in February, where we still got, full month of spring training for injuries to happen, for depth charts to shift around? I mean, if you're drafting in, say, the final weekend, then we have more clarity on who the ends of the real world rosters are going to be. And so there are probably a couple more options that you don't need to take a chance on. But if you're drafting in February, does that push you even more towards that aggressive approach? Or do you think it's just generally good all the time?
The aggressive approach is fine in the early goings, like you had said. You'll get just even more information on hitter playing time as well as depth charts. So yeah, I think that it's probably better early, like you said, because in the latter goings, if he, for example, has a Quinn Matthews that has the inside track to rotation spot, he's going to go round 21, round 20. So same thing with Hayden Wesneski. By taking the volatility of not a guaranteed spot, he got a discount on those 2 players. So yeah, I think there's a lot to what you just said there.
All right, so your bench, you grabbed Nolan Shanwell. I guess you needed another option at the corner spot since you waited so long. And then Nick Gonzalez, Tomoyuki Sagano, Dean Kramer, Chase DeLauder, Brandon Sproat, and Jacob Wilson. So, like you said, some high risk, high reward guys there. DeLauder is somebody who I think people really should be interested in with one of their last 3 picks. He's a very talented young player who also definitely has far from a lock on a opening day roster spot. Probably even an underdog to break camp with the team, but if he does, quite good. So I think that's a great example. Tell me a little bit more about Sproat as well. He's someone Uncle Ted mentioned as one of his late round targets here.
Yeah, so with DeLauder first, I just want to say that Dave McDonald kind of warned me that it's not the Guardians' way to be so aggressive, and I'm afraid he's probably right unless he
True.
absolutely breaks the door down. But your opportunity cost is next to nothing in round 28, so I figured it was worth a shot. Now, as far as Sproat goes, he had an absolutely tremendous run in Double-A last year with 62 innings, 77 strikeouts, and 15 walks. So I think he's a good prospect, a good pitching prospect, but I think he's going into an absolutely elite situation with the pitching coaching they have in New York as well as Park. There's also a need there with multiple pitching injuries happening in the Big Apple for the Mets. So I do like Sproat as far as Fab leagues. But yeah, as far as Mets pitchers, that's just something I'm trying to target.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I always love whoever finds their way into the back of that Mets rotation. It's been Tyler McGill or David Peterson for years now. When they're in there, they're interesting enough. They're not always in there, but when they are, just real quick, I'll throw out my bench here. I went extremely pitcher heavy. I think Cutter Crawford, actually, my 24th round pick. I misspoke earlier. He's actually in my starting lineup. John Kenzie Noel's in my bench. I forgot I had blocked off my util spot with Kyle Schwarber. But Crawford had fallen because he is dealing with a knee injury right now. I figured he was worth a chance in the reserve rounds, though. Then Kyle Harrison, Michael McGreevy, Andrew Heaney, Matt Strom, Kobe Mayo, and Tyler Holton ended up with a couple more relievers there and a high upside hitter who I may drop in Mayo. But that takes us to the end of the draft review. I think we should go take a quick look at, did you like your team? Did it end up the way you wanted? Was this the plan? Was this something you were happy enough as it evolved? Or do you think that you made a couple mistakes?
In a league like this that's so tough, it's going to be tough to come out ecstatic. I'm comfortable with how the build turned out. I feel happy that I don't have to go crazy looking for closers, but as far as my starting pitching depth, that could be my death knell in this league because I waited a long time to fill that second SP. And as far as my bench starters, guys like Dean Kramer and Shigano are no one's idea of an upside guy. So we'll see. That's kind of a few of my issues there, but I'm mostly okay with how it panned out.
Yeah, I think for myself, I'm also mostly okay. I think, like you said, it's a tough room, so it's hard to leave thrilled. I think that I ended up a little bit too risky because I was willing to take some of the players that the rest of the room didn't want, and maybe I shouldn't have taken all of those, but I'm far from the riskiest team here. Again, we talked earlier about Michael Govier's Acuna, DeGrom, Luis Robert team, so there's certainly ways to go over the top on risk, and I didn't do that. I just ended up with a few guys more than I probably would have said otherwise. Do you want to shout out anybody else's team who here impressed you before we head out?
There was a lot of builds that I think were really good and interesting too. That's the interesting thing about a tough league like this is, we didn't quite have a Dalton Del Don type build. But I think that Matty Wood did a really good job as Team 4. He's really hoping that Judge provides, American League leading home run totals. But if he gets that, he's got himself an elite closer with Josh Hader, 3 potentially frontline arms with Blake Snell, Yamamoto, and Tanner Bybee to go with Jeff Hoffman as a second closer and a few excellent hitters with CJ Abrams, Brian Reynolds, and Alex Bregman. So I love that build that Matty Davis did. But really all these teams, I wouldn't be surprised if any of them were to win because everyone else just did a pretty good job.
Yeah, a whole bunch of teams that I'm happy enough with. I think there's people who were taking my targets throughout the draft, and that's good. That means that other people like the players I like. That must mean I'm onto something. That's going to do it, I think, for our draft review. Would be curious, listeners, whose team you think is going to win the league. We'll find out at the end of the year. Maybe is it going to be Lucas on his back-to-back? We have not had a back-to-back winner. I should mention, Lucas, you were on the show last summer, and at that point, I think you were sitting about 6th and I was sitting 8th, and our topic for that day was, how do you come back late in the season when you're sitting in the middle of the pack? And you did it. So whatever you say in today's episode, I think we can assume is going to come true, exactly like you said. That's your track record here.
But that being said, I had won by an absolute hair, so that just shows you how balanced this league is. I mean, it's going to come down to impact ads as well as streaming your right pitchers at the right times and avoiding the wrong drop. So this is going to be such a tough and competitive league. We always play till the final buzzer, and there's a lot of parity in such a tough league where it's balanced. You're not going to see the overall winner of Earth come out of a league this tough just because it's going to be hard to separate yourself.
Yeah, I think none of the Glarf contestants finished even in the top 10 in the overall in Earth because there was quite a bit of competition. But hey, it's my favorite league out there.
Same.
Love the level of competition. A really tough battle to the end every single year. Really excited to see how this one plays out. Thank you to our hosts again, Aaron Cumming, Marty Tallman, and Michael Govier, who arranged an excellent weekend for us. Thank you to Dave McDonald, the commissioner of Earth and of Glarf, for organizing such a great contest here and also finding ways to tie in charity. Always impressed with the fantasy community's ability to include a charitable component in nearly everything. Definitely hope that never stops. That's going to do it for today's episode. Lucas, where can people find you and your work?
Yeah, you can find me on Blue Sky. Just enter my name, Lucas Beery, there. Post all my work from FTN there on Blue Sky. So we're doing spring training roundups right now as far as detailing all the news as far as it goes, but we've got tons of great fantasy baseball tools over at FTN, similar to RotoWire. So a couple of must-have tools, in my opinion. Get ahead of your competition and make your life a lot easier.
All right, go check out Lucas's work over there. That's going to do it for today's episode. Thank you, Lucas. Thank you to our sponsor, Fantrax, and it'll be Todd and Clay tomorrow on the RotoWire Fantasy Baseball Podcast.